Colors of Politics, NRI, on RI Free Radio. Just as the rainbow has many colors, there are multiple opinions and views of the way our state government should be run. Let us be to the point and deliver the truth. It is time to break down the colors of politics.
All right. Thank you for listening. This is Colors of Politics in RI on rifreeradio.org, and you can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Colors of RI. Tonight we're going to be speaking with Daryl Gould, and he's going to tell us a little bit about his recent campaign and some points of why he was running, and then we're going to go into a couple different topics. Thanks for joining us, Daryl.
Thank you very much for having me, Amy.
So why don't you tell everybody what your district is and what your motivation was of why you chose to run?
Certainly. So I was a candidate for district rep in 67, which is comprised part of Warren and part of Barrington. The seat was held by Representative Jan Malik for about 20 years. A number of those campaigns that he ran were unopposed. So that was part of my motivation for getting involved. I wanted to at least keep people honest. Going into it, I certainly didn't expect to displace a 20-year incumbent, and ultimately I didn't have to. Another gentleman by the name of Jason Knight entered the race as a Democrat and primaried against Mr. Malik, and ultimately won the primary. So it was eye-opening when that happened, because I just assumed that I'd be going up against Jan, and he'd do a number on me. But all of a sudden the dynamics changed. To further complicate things, I guess the primary part of the campaign, that got pretty nasty between the two of them, and I don't believe Jan felt like he appreciated the way that it ended. So he actually launched a write-in campaign, which ultimately ended up being fairly significant. And so it ended up being ultimately a three-way race. And Mr. Knight, who was the gentleman who entered the Democrat from Barrington, was ultimately successful in winning the election.
Okay, so you say he had a good write-in campaign. So I assume that was.
It was. I mean, write-in campaigns are notorious for being difficult to, as far as being successful, and I believe the final numbers were somewhere. Please, this minute even add up to 100. I know I ended up with about 27%. I believe Malik ended up with 16% or 17%, and Mr. Knight ended up with just over 50. So given that it was, and his campaign really, as far as the write-in was concerned, was he didn't announce that until 30 days after the primary, which really ultimately gave him about 4 to 5 weeks to mount that campaign. So it was interesting. I mean, I said all the time my race will likely be a case study in election politics. Being a libertarian and running as third party is always going to be a challenge. What was interesting was when, and I don't know if it was an intentional tactic or if Mr. Knight Forrest Gumped his way into a great political decision. But what had happened was after the primary, Mr. Knight continued to focus on Malik, even though Malik technically wasn't in the race. He was running only as a write-in. So I thought that was, at the time, I thought it was foolish, because why wouldn't you focus on the other person on the ballot? But I think, again, I don't know if I haven't spoken to Jason about this directly, but I think that that he actually, by treating me like the third party, it actually did keep the focus off of, even though it was two Democrats and one was a write-in, it really did, at least in the local press and whatnot, it really kept the focus on the two of them because, like I said, they had gotten a little bit nasty with one another, and that's what sells magazines and newspapers and gets people to tune in and think along those lines. So I think it was, like I said, a kind of in my opinion, it may have been a distraction, but ultimately, whether that was a significant factor or not, we won't know. But ultimately, Mr. Knight was successful, so kudos to him.
Yeah, and negativity always sells, as crappy as that is.
Well, and that's generally the playbook when you're going against an incumbent, which is why I was in part relieved I didn't have to go against Malik. When you're going against the long-term entrenched incumbent, the political playbook 101 is you go negative against the incumbent. It's not my style. And it's one of those things where I tend to be I try, if not tend to be, a very logical person, which can have its pluses and minuses like anything else. I tend to look at things through that lens. It's what I do on a daily basis professionally. I have to be fairly clinical about our work. And so that's how I approach politics and political issues, is really looking at its surface and look at things logically. I don't like the term common sense. It's arbitrary.
I agree with you totally on that. I was just saying, I agree with you on the common sense. I can't stand that attached to political statements.
No, and I saw it a lot. Mr. Knight ran on gun control. That was really his one issue. So for him, it was, I get approached by a lot of people, and like, what's your stance on common sense gun control? And to define common sense is difficult enough as it is, but like I was saying, I think it's a tool that's used to poison an argument. Amy, if I say that my solution is a smart solution, and you're arguing it against it, and proposing your own, then therefore your opposing solution or argument is not smart. So it's the same thing with common sense. When you say you're proposing common sense gun legislation, people who argue against it are arguing against or being perceived to argue against common sense, and that's a losing argument. But it's not really taking into consideration the merits of the argument itself. It just kind of poisons the well early, and you're continually trying to play catch-up in order to make your point.
Yeah, I completely agree. I know if I'm reading comments or articles or anything from legislators online or in the paper itself where they're quoted and they use the term common sense, even if I agree with them, using the term still makes me cringe. I just can't stand that.
Right.
So
it's been it was an interesting race, like I said. Post race has been it's been interesting. I think my goals, and this is kind of an evolution during the campaign. Initially, and I've never been one to. I don't view politics as my future career or anything along those lines, which can be liberating, because if it's not something you're looking at as, like I said, a career or something you're really vested in, it can be very liberating because you don't really have anything to lose. So, and you can go out there and fight and try and do like I always say, the right thing for the right reason. But ultimately, if you don't get in, that's okay. I mean, as you know, one of my mentors was Bob Healy, and politically, Bob practically made a career of losing political races. So, one of the things he taught me was, losing isn't always a loss across the board. I think his 2014 gubernatorial campaign is a perfect example of that. But I think that you can always learn from these things, and I've gotten a lot of positive feedback. I've gotten people come out and say, it's a brand of politics I wasn't familiar with, and they're appreciative of the fact that we did a little bit of informing and educating while I was out there, just trying to let people know what a libertarian is, because everybody has their own kind of preconceived notion of what it is. And I think it's a platform that can be very broad-reaching. And I think that the whole socially liberal, fiscally conservative, most people fall in 2016. Most people fall somewhere in that spectrum. And I've had a lot of people come up to me and say, I was, I'm technically registered Republican, but I've always been libertarian leaning, and maybe the party wasn't organized when they moved to the state 10 years ago, whatever the case may be. But I think all three candidates, myself, Billy Hunt and Lee Barretto, I think we all did a good job of putting a decent face on, of what a libertarian is.
Yeah, it definitely develops conversation, which in a lot of times is worth a campaign, regardless of winning, is getting a message out and making more people hear the message.
Moving the ball down the field.
Right. And the more that are aware, the more thinking, planting seeds. Never know what comes later.
Well, and I think one of the failings of the American society as a whole is we've grown tremendously impatient, and everybody wants things to happen in one election cycle. And the reality is, some of these things, especially when you're talking about large scale, partisan politics and the duopoly of Republicans and Democrats running everything, that even if you make great strides, that is something that's going to take a generation to change. And I think that can be daunting for people, but ultimately you have to make up your mind. Are you looking to be the person to make history, or are you looking to be a person to make a difference? And they're not always the same thing, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive either.
I completely agree with you there. Did you have 2 or 3 particular things that you really wanted to address and really was like a motivating factor for particular change? Did you have 2 or 3 specific topics?
Yeah, when I started the campaign, everyone has their issues. For me, it was repealing the tolls and ending the crony capitalist deals that we're seeing constantly here in Rhode Island. But that, and again, there's an evolution there, where what ultimately I realized was I never had any interest in necessarily the power or money or anything like that could be whether good or bad associated with that type of position. And what I realized, probably it may have been halfway through the campaign, my hope was really to use, ultimately, if I were successful and I got up there, I would be the only libertarian. You have to. Politics is a team game, which I totally understand. So it's very difficult to do things as an individual. So, and being third party, even more so. So the expectation for a third party or an independent candidate to get up there and really make waves and do a lot on the legislative side is going to be very difficult, certainly in a freshman term. So what I really saw this giving me the opportunity to do is really use it as leverage. So, for example, I've always been very involved in education. I have 3 young kids who are in public school, so they're Common Core, part testing, mandatory HPV testing, things along those lines. I've always been somewhat of an activist, and I'll work with other parents or teachers or whoever the case may be on these particular issues. And what I realized was what I hoped rather would be that I'd be able to use the influence of the seat in order to get things done. So where my, the local superintendent of schools is very accustomed to me, setting meetings and sitting down with them and talking about these different issues, it obviously carries a lot more weight when you go in and say, I'm the state rep, and there's this bullying issue that we need to deal with, and it's systemic, and there's some policy and procedure things that are broken here, and we need to do better for the families in the district. So that's really where I saw that, and somewhat being like a government watchdog. Again, because this wasn't something where I was looking at spending the next, 4, 6, 8, 10, and beyond years up at Smith Hill. I was more than happy. It was really to try and shine a light in the dark places. And really, again, going back to the inform and educate, it was really my goal and I may still do this anyway, was really to have monthly meetings with people in the district and say, these are the things that are actually going on at the State House. This is the legislation that's being proposed. And just really getting people in the know, because I think that's one of the biggest challenges right now is, and I certainly understand why, people don't follow politics as closely as I think they should, especially at the local level.
Yes, I can agree with you there. Most people are not paying attention. A lot of people don't pay attention at the state level, never mind the town council, school committee, local level.
Right.
But
90% of your interaction with government, Amy, is at the local level. So wouldn't it make the most sense to spend time focusing on the people who, the administrators who are on your school committee, who, much like yourself, congratulations.
Thanks.
Who are really going to have, who are really going to have an impact when it comes to the local school level. I mean, we're all worried about Donald Trump and what he's going to do, and there's certainly enough to worry about there. But the people at our state level are going to have way more of an impact on us than Donald Trump is.
Yes, exactly. The town council can make a decision in 1 month that will affect you personally within a month or two after the decision is made, and school committee can change a policy that changes an entire atmosphere. So yeah, people should really pay attention to what's happening in their town, because that's where they can really make a difference. You can influence your town council, you can influence your school committee, and you could even influence your representative or your senator, but the really down local is where it's just 5 or 6 people together meeting once a month at the town hall or wherever it is in that town. That's where you can really stand up and say something for your town. So yeah, people definitely should, and I think it's a great idea that you're talking about doing something with discussing with people that reside in your area, maybe even a mailing list where you can send out emails, because it might become more of a commitment than you think, saying I'm going to do this once a month forever.
Well, it's interesting because there are certain things you can do, and this takes some adjustment. I'm trying to figure out how to, I'm a resident of Warren, and Warren represents about 50% of the district. And so, during the campaign, obviously I had a built-in reason to be very present in Barrington. There were some issues that, because I don't live in Barrington, and a perfect example is the expansion of, they need a new middle school. And because I'm not in that school district, it's something that I didn't really have a deep understanding of, and what the budgetary numbers looked like, and what the need was, and the whole nine. So I would attend meetings, while I was campaigning, just to learn more about it, find out more about the district. And so it's very easy when you're in in Barrington, and you're talking to people, and I can introduce myself as, Daryl Gould, candidate for district rep. But given that the next election is about 2 years away, it's awkward, and again, I'm trying to figure out how that works exactly, so that if I am interested in running again in this district, how do you explain your presence in places that otherwise you have no good reason to be there, other than possibly, and again, much like I said, informing yourself about the district for a future Senate or district rep rate.
Well, you're still part of the district, so you could easily just be a child advocate for the district versus a child advocate for Warren. You could just, And
fortunately, I have some good relationships, because there was no Republican in my race. The Republican, and much of his individuals, were very supportive of my candidacy. And so I also developed some good relationships there, one of which is Jimmy Kazunis, who was the candidate for Senate in East Providence, Barrington, Bristol. And Jimmy's a great guy, and he's a Barrington guy. So my hope is that after the new year we can sit down and talk, and he can be the Barrington guy and I'll be the Warren guy, and we can kind of work together to put together those presentations and do monthly, meetings, and hopefully, one of the things I really hope to do over the next 2 years is inform and educate people on what a bond is, because every year or every election, it seems like every spending, every bond-related issue gets green-lighted, and I think there are a lot of people out there who don't, and I'm not saying this to be insulting, they just don't understand what a bond is. And that's perfectly fine. If it's not something you're exposed to and you deal with, whether it's professionally or if you don't follow politics and do finance, you might not know what that is anyway. But I think a lot of people think grant and not necessarily a loan. And so I think we see a lot of people who are approving these bonds, if they realize the impact on our tax structure, albeit through an increase, then they may not be so quick to approve some of these things. And like anything else, some are good and some are bad.
Yeah, and a bond is definitely a lot closer to a loan than as far as an easy comparison, because it sure as heck ain't a grant. We're not getting that money for free. If anybody's just tuning in now, you're listening to Colors of Politics, and we're discussing some campaign trail information and advocacy ideas with Daryl Gould tonight. So, do you have a specific, is the school system and working with the, I'm not even going to try to pronounce his last name because I'll murder it, who you were just referring to, and working with him between Barrington Warren. Yeah, there you go. Or is that where you think you want to begin your first steps in working forward with the community?
I think so. There's always the state issues that I'm going to follow, and I'll be active, and I'll show up at hearings and testify if I think it's appropriate or I have something to contribute. But I think it's the beauty, I guess, of the end of the campaign is you need to fill the void with something. If you're campaigning the right way, you are constantly out there. I mean, it's a daily thing. You're walking the district, knocking on doors, going to events, and then when all of a sudden it ends, and if you're not successful and you don't have the actual job to replace the campaign with, you find that there's this huge void. And so there have been some timely things. There's a woman in town who just coincidentally happened to start this initiative called Volunteer Warren, and it's all Warrenites, getting together and working together to improve the town, and that's in a variety of different ways, whether it's business development or education-based things. And so there's a lot of volunteerism there. So I'm excited to be a part of that. There's always going to be, during the campaign, there were some families who reached out to me because we had talked about bullying issues in the past. So I think that that's something that I'll likely sink my teeth in. And there's also, some business development things in the downtown Warren area that I think there's a ton of potential. I think we've already started to see this renaissance where the area is turning into kind of this foodie artist district, which is fantastic. We just need to get things moving a little bit faster. But those are probably the things that I'll get involved in, and I mean I already am. But it's just a matter of digging a little bit deeper, and there's some great people that I've had the great fortune to meet either prior to the campaign or through the campaign. So if nothing else, that experience gave me some relationships that will help me hopefully make a difference in my little part of the state.
Yes, networking and social connection of knowing who is where and what they are focused on, all of that definitely helps when you're trying to stand up on behalf of others.
Well, and you know this, Amy. I mean, it's one of those things where these aren't formal seats. These aren't reps and senators or town councilmen and women and things along those lines. So it's really, you have to, for the most part, seek these people out or seek out these initiatives. And, then there's also figuring out, because especially on social issues, you'll find that there's more than one group. And so you need to figure out, okay, where do I end up? What are these groups and what are their motivators and who's involved? But it's one of those things where, unless you're really, and social media certainly helps, but unless you're involved, it's just they're people you're not going to come across, and you might not even know that they're out there. So again, I think that's one of the benefits of campaigning is it exposes you to, almost by, it forces you to get out there and meet people that you otherwise might not. And you're only going to become a better person or legislator or activist as a result of that.
Oh, yeah, I definitely can relate with my statewide campaign and what I've been working on for 2 years now. And I wouldn't have met you initially, and I wouldn't have met a lot of...
True. Perfect example.
So, yeah, there's definitely meeting people, connections, and whether the campaign is successful or not, and in my opinion, all campaigns are successful just because the seat isn't necessarily won. I could not imagine not having the experiences that I have had in the last 2 years and the connections and also sightseeing, because I've driven over more roads in Rhode Island in 2 years than I think I've...
Fortunately, we live in a very small state, and I remember that during the Healy campaign. When we were out, it was a very small number of us who were working very hard to push that campaign. And so when you talk about sign delivery and things along those lines, we were driving all over the place. And I remember saying that probably on a daily basis. Thank God we live in such a small state, because if we lived in, if you're trying to run a gubernatorial race in even Massachusetts, you're talking about 3 hours from one end of the state to the other, as opposed to an hour. So it drastically changes the resource requirements and everything that would go along with it.
Oh yeah, it would be a whole nother level to run a campaign in a state just 3 times as big as this. Never mind the much bigger ones. Right. Definitely, I completely agree with you, and I have to say, in my opinion, as stressful as there can be some moments and as frustrating as some moments can be, overall, to me, it's exciting and it's motivating to keep going. And personally, every time there's a negative that I experience, I just feel that much more fire to go out and do that much more positive. So, yeah, I really feel campaigning.
When you get immersed in this stuff, and you know this as well as anybody, once you start to educate yourself on certain issues, there's motivations, and some of it, unfortunately, and I hate that this is the case, but anger and frustration. We're Rhode Island, so we're part of the political landscape. When oftentimes I'm a stat guy, so during debates and such, I'll pull out numbers and data, and I had a couple people come up to me afterwards and say, where are you getting this information and how do you memorize it? And I said, listen, this isn't. I said, if you follow politics, and some of this can just be loose stuff on social media or the stuff you're getting out of Go Local or the Providence Journal, whatever the case may be, there's this, I don't know, underlying trend of you read things and it kind of gets burned into your subconscious. When you read something like the state of Rhode Island, for example, has a population of 1 million people.
We have about 1 minute, just so you know.
1 million people. So we have 1 million people. Now, our budget is $9 billion. Okay? Now, geographically, we're also a very small state. Now, if you compare us to New Hampshire, now, geographically, a much bigger state, and so they have to have more infrastructure. There's more roadways. They have to get services out to a lot of different people. geographically, so it's going to be a bigger form of government. Now, so New Hampshire has 1.3 million people, so their population is 30% larger than our own. And their budget, their state budget, again, ours is $9 billion, theirs is $4.5. So they have 30% more people, it's a bigger state, and their state budget is half of what ours is. So when you read those things, it elicits a visceral or emotional reaction. And
Yeah.
you remember it. So
Yeah.
it's not that-
Exactly.
it's not that you sit there
The
and
more
study.
emotional connection you have, the more that you remember what the information is. I thank you so much for your time this evening and for joining us. We have run out. It was
Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, of course. I love talking to you. So thank you everyone for listening tonight. Colors of Politics. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Colors of RI. Have a great night.